have been planning to do a video on transubstantiation ever since I first started my channel, but then it was kind of brought to the forefront because of some comments I was getting, and I was clarifying what transubstantiation was, and then I decided I should just do the video on it sooner. So when I was going through my script, I was relying so heavily on Transubstantiation by Dr. Brett Salkeld that I decided I would just reach out to him and ask if he would be willing to talk about his book instead of me talking about his book. And he so graciously agreed. This was actually our second attempt at this recording because I had so many tech issues last week that we had to reschedule it. So we actually had to be in my garage because that's where the router was and the most stable connection. So that's why you'll see in the background my husband's Falcon, and then we'll be talking about transubstantiation, obviously. So I hope you enjoy both of those things. So Dr. Brett Salkeld, Dr. Brett Salkeld. Dr. Brett Salkeld. Thank you so much for joining me today and just persisting through the tech issues that we had last week. So
no problem. Yeah, no, it's great to be here. Nice to meet you, Amy.
Yes, you too. So just to start, we will talk about how did you get started working with the topic of transubstantiation, and what's your background in this topic?
Yeah, I went to grad school in theology with an interest in ecumenical dialogue. So I wanted to help Catholics and Protestants understand one another better, usually on like standard like Catholic Protestant polemic stuff, the Pope, Mary, purgatory. So I wrote my master's thesis on purgatory, and that's also a small book. And then I was looking for a topic with my director. And I wrote a paper for her in a class on ecumenical dialogue. And I wrote a paper on Eucharistic presence. And both of us at the end of the semester independently came to each other and said, I think we've got the dissertation topic. Because it was such an interesting development for me. I had actually, I think this is a fun story. I had actually said something before I made a presentation in class. I was meeting with her and we were talking about it. And I had sort of casually, without really thinking about what the words meant, mentioned something about Christ's physical presence. And she was like, that's not the best adverb, or physically would be the adverb. That's not the best adjective, right? And I was like, oh, well, that's really interesting, because I've been in conversations where Catholics think you have to say Christ is physically present. And Protestants, not all Protestants, Lutherans in particular, some of them actually even like that term, but most Protestants don't like the language of physical presence. And I was like, well, if that's not the best language for the Catholic position, then maybe there's more room here for mutual understanding than I thought. So that's when I started digging. And then I wrote this paper, and it was very exciting. And then she graded the paper, and both of us said, I think we've got a doctoral dissertation. So I went whole hog. I read everything I could find about transubstantiation for like 2 years. And then I wrote my dissertation, which ended up being the book, Transubstantiation, Theology, History, and Christian Unity. So, which is how people, come to interview me on podcasts about this.
Yeah, it was an excellent book. I feel like I've been in apologetics a long time because I converted when I was 13, and there was so much in there that I did not know that is really crucial to know about transubstantiation.
I felt the same. I was like, if Catholics are misrepresenting our own position, it's hard to blame our dialogue partners for getting it wrong. And this actually, and if you read like the literature I went through, is chock full of Protestants and Catholics misrepresenting this doctrine, right? So yes. It's like, okay, we there's work to do.
Yeah, it was excellent, much needed. So thank you for gifting that to the world. But
you're so welcome.
So the term substance, kind of going into that physical, the substance, we talk about transubstantiation, and most people think of a substance as something physical or material. And it's really a Thomistic and philosophical term that's kind of esoteric, that probably is not readily translatable to most people today. So could you explain the difference between substance in transubstantiation versus the common use?
Yeah, no, that's really key. I mean, I go into this in some detail because the term has changed its meaning. And in fact, most of that change took place between Thomas Aquinas, who uses it to describe Eucharistic presence, and the Reformation, which rejects it. But when they reject substantial presence, which, by the way, if you're looking for an adjective, that's the one. Like, that's way better than physical. And we can talk more about other adjectives later. But substantial presence was affirmed by Thomas, but then and by the whole church along with him, and then rejected at the time of the Reformation. But in the intervening years, the term had changed from meaning one thing to meaning what we take it to mean today, usually some sort of physical object, or if you found a powdery substance at the crime scene, you mean the physical stuff. At the time of the development of the doctrine of transubstantiation, and Thomas Aquinas kind of perfects it, but it emerges a couple generations before him. There's this dust up in the church about how do we best describe Christ's presence, and the struggle is between an overly literalistic, physical, even cannibalistic kind of description on the one hand, and a merely symbolic kind of description on the other hand. And neither of those are adequate to the church's historical understanding. But those were kind of, and it's interesting that those are sometimes how we view the debate today. But substance emerges as a way of being able to say something that's really, really real, that's not physical. In fact, it's more real than the physical. So what we encounter with our senses are physical things. We encounter texture, color, size, all those kinds of things. Things we would call adjectives, right? It's white and it's round and it's smooth, if we're describing the Eucharistic host, right? And that's what our senses have access to, is just these adjectives, which the philosophical language here is accidents. We can only ever perceive accidents, but it's our mind that affirms the presence of a real thing, a noun, underneath those accidents. So your eyes see something, your tongue tastes something, but it's your mind that says this is bread, right? You only encounter whiteness, softness, flatness, smoothness, roundness, but your mind can abstract from all of the sense data and affirm the presence of an actual existing thing. And that thing is what we call substance. And it's not a physical thing. The accidents are the physical thing, right? Which is why it comes in so handy to describe the Eucharistic presence and Eucharistic change. Because if you've ever been to Mass, you will see that there's no physical change. That's the point of the doctrine, is we need to be able to affirm some kind of change that's not a physical change. And a tempting way to do that is to say, well, the community, we all agree that it means something different, right? So that's like the merely symbolic version. That's a kind of straightforward way that you could have some kind of presence or some kind of change that's not physical. And we might think that's nothing. But it's actually not nothing, because if you would get upset if someone burned your nation's flag, then you're saying that the community agreeing that this physical artifact has a certain meaning for us that's really important. Well, that's not nothing if you think burning a flag might be a problem, right? But the church has said, but that's not enough, because that locates what's going on in the Eucharist in the minds of the congregation. And the Eucharist is not something that the congregation does for itself. The Eucharist is a gift from God. And that's why that memorialist or symbolic version, which is intelligible, you can see what you mean by it, it's inadequate. Now, there's still something happening with signs here, but it's not us deciding that signs have a certain meaning and agreeing to treat something in a certain way. It's Thomas Aquinas says right at the beginning of his treatment on sacraments, he says, God uses sacraments because humans are sign readers. That's how we relate to the world. And so he's going to communicate to us through a series of signs. It doesn't mean we're only playing a game where we agree that something means something, but it does mean that God is approaching us through that aspect of our humanity, our ability to make meaning from physical phenomena, right? And so it's a sign, but we always want to say it's not only a sign. Typically, when only a sign means you and I agree in our minds what it means. But no, God God is the one who determines what it means, and you and I accept it. That's the difference, right?
Gotcha. Yeah, that's very well explained. I feel like I have
thank
to
you.
go back. Yeah, I'll have to go back and rewatch it a couple times just for my own sake. So you kind of already answered this, but I'm just going to read the question I had.
Sure.
So a lot of people in my comments specifically, which is kind of what I always wanted to make this video, but then I kind of was like, I have to do this quicker than I intended, because a lot of people in my comments, and mostly Protestants, and like you said, can't really blame them because I think Catholics don't say this very well either, but they always assume like Christ is present in a biological way. And you kind of mentioned that's more like transaccidentation, not transubstantiation, which we talked about. But so can we ask, is Jesus literally present, or what do you just say to that question? Is Jesus literally present?
Right. So the question of which adjectives or adverbs you're going to use here is a really interesting one, because you could say Christ is literally present and put some caveats on, like, and by that I mean this, but I don't mean that. Or like biologically is not one I've heard, but you could do the same. You could pick any adjective or adverb you want and then say, yes, but, and so my recommendation is stick with words that actually have a theological pedigree, right? So to say Christ is literally present is not something the church ever says. That's not in the catechism. It's not in any encyclicals. It's not in Thomas Aquinas. It depends what you mean by literally, right? And so you could do the same with biologically. Well, it's his body, which is a biological thing. So in that sense, it's biological, but it's not present in the way that bodies are normally present. So maybe it's not biological, right? The tradition says Christ is really, truly, and substantially present. And those terms all have a theological history that tells you what they mean and don't mean. So it's not up to me to say, well, I'm going to say he's literally present, and then I'm going to qualify it. If I just say he's really present, then I can say, and the church tells us what that means if we look at the history of the use of the term, right? So let's take really, for example, because that's maybe the most common one, to say Christ is really present. To say he's really present is to say something like, God determines the reality of this part of creation, right? It's not something else. It's not us making meaning or anything else. It is determined by God, and that's kind of the root of the difference between any theology of real presence and other Eucharistic theologies, is that God is the main actor. Substantially emerges when we say substance is the best term we can find to talk about something that's really real, really, really real, but not physical. It's this thing that's apprehensible to the mind. Truly emerges in these debates that precede the development of transubstantiation. And it's part of a pair. And the question is Christ truly present, or is he present only in figure? Which is what we would sometimes say, merely symbolic or something. And it's truly gets affirmed over against this only in figure, right? So really is like God is the actor. Truly is like, it's not just a symbol. Substantially it's this element of reality that lies underneath the physical. Substance actually literally means like stands under. So it's like underneath the physical, that you can apprehend with your mind, but you can never perceive with your senses because it's not an accident. Another adjective that I think is legitimate is sacramentally. Christ is obviously sacramentally present. Now, some people wonder if that means just merely symbolically, but no, like Catholics believe God really acts in the sacraments. But it's a further specification on really that includes the sense that it will be operative through symbol. It's not reducible to a symbol, but it is operative through symbol because it's a sacrament. That's how they work, right? So before you get to the Eucharist in Thomas's Summa, you have this initial discussion of what sacraments are and how they work, and it's like, well, they work through signs, right? And Thomas didn't make that up. That's as old as the church, basically, right?
Right. I'm going to ask you another question on sign in just a second, and I did not
Yeah.
send this one ahead of you, but
No worries.
I have a question. Yeah. So when you're talking about really present, it kind of triggers something like that God is the actor. So some people feel like the Eucharistic prayers, like the epiclesis, the words of consecration, and then the offering are sort of like, they treat it sometimes as if it's an incantation of something the priest does, and if he doesn't do it, exactly so, then it doesn't work. But I feel like that is like, that's exactly what we don't teach, is that God
Right.
is the one acting. And so it's our participation, and like we have to have form, but it's not a formalism kind
Right,
of.
right. This is really interesting. At the time of the Reformation, there's this debate about ex opere operato, which means something like it operates by the fact of having done the work. Like, just if you show up and do what the church intends, it's gonna work. Which looks like magic from a certain perspective, and that's what Protestants worry about. But what it's actually designed to do is to protect us from a magical imagining that says if a priest stumbles over a syllable, it doesn't work, because it's not. What matters is intention. So here's um, a case study, right? The church, the priest walks by a bakery and he's rehearsing. He's trying to memorize. He's a new priest and he wants to make sure he's got the words of consecration down. He's on his way to mass and he walks by the bakery and he's rehearsing in his mind and he's muttering under his breath, right, the words of consecration, and he walks by a bakery. Well, what happens? Well, the answer is actually nothing, right? Because first of all, he did not intend to consecrate all that bread. But second, it's not in the right context. You don't just randomly consecrate bread. Like if you had a priest over for dinner, he wouldn't just consecrate bread at like before the meal outside of the context of the celebration of the mass, right? So what you said is exactly right. We don't teach it as a magical kind of thing, even though you shouldn't mess around with the words. They're not your plaything. But the church is very clear that the efficacy of the sacrament does not depend on your getting it perfect, or for that matter, this was another issue with ex opere operato, with you being above a certain level of sinner, because it's a scandal if some kind of sinners are the ones consecrating your Eucharist. Well, what kind of sinner? Because you can't find anyone who's not a sinner. So at what, okay, this guy did this thing that was kind of bad. But this guy did this other thing that's really bad. And then this guy did like the worst thing you could imagine. Oh, I guess none of his sacraments are valid, right? I guess my kids aren't baptized. I guess I never received the Eucharist or confession. The church is like, no, that can't be, it cannot be dependent on that. But if someone messes it up on purpose, that would indicate an intention to not do what the church intends. And that's where you end up with trouble, right? You can't do it by accident. You can't do it because you're just a screw up. It has to be that you're like actually deceiving people because you're not intending what the church intends, right? So that's really key for thinking about how things aren't magic, right? Because magic works by formulas and it's kind of mechanical and it's a grasp after power, where it operates in the realm of intention, right?
Beautifully said. Thank you. Yeah, that I feel like I just was glad to touch on that
Oh,
quickly.
please. Yeah. Yeah. I hope I got it mostly right.
No, yeah, I just was studying that. How do you say it? Opere operando? I was like, you got it right.
Okay. Ex opere operato. Yeah.
Yes. So like you were saying, it does seem like we get nervous about using the word sign because we don't want to be too Protestant, but it is totally okay. And that like the word sign in the sacramental sense doesn't mean just a symbol at all, which you touched on. But can you explain how the understanding of sign has actually changed or evolved historically as well?
Right. Right. So in the early church, it never would have occurred to anyone that calling it a sign was a problem. You can read the church fathers, they call it a sign all the time. And in fact, you can read church fathers who are known for even more graphic language about the Eucharist that sometimes might hinge on what you might call the physical. And there's a range within the fathers. And like Ambrose, for instance, is known for more graphic language. His student Augustine is known for less graphic language. But even Ambrose, who uses more graphic language, will talk totally unself-consciously about the Eucharist being a sign. I mean, it's just perfectly obvious to them. It only becomes a problem when in later generations, some people start saying it's only a sign, by which they mean it's something that we agree upon in our minds that doesn't have any external referent that changes, right? And once some people float that idea, and Protestants aren't the first ones to do this, it emerges. I go through some of the historical details in the book, but there's this interesting like beginning of it in a monastery in France in like the 9th century, where the emperor sends a letter to the monks and says, "Is Christ present truly or in figure?" We talked about that before. And two different monks write two different essays, and one of them says truly, and the other one says in figure. But they don't actually seem to disagree with each other. There's been a false dichotomy that's been put to them, and they each chose one side of it. But over the course of about 200 years, this gap that opens up there at this monastery called Corbie gets wider and wider, to the point where a fellow named Berengarius, who some of your listeners will recognize that name, he comes out with a kind of full-blown, it's only a symbol kind of rhetoric. And that sends the church sort of apoplectic. Like he gets hauled in front of the Pope, and he's got to swear these oaths, and I go through a lot of detail on that, but the point is, Berengarius is sort of known as like the first heretic of this, merely symbolic kind of thing. It's interesting at the Reformation, Martin Luther is like, it's a good thing the Pope made him swear these oaths, and it would be good if every Pope was as good as that Pope was when he forced Berengarius, because Luther himself is very big on real presence, and so he is against Berengarius, and his opponents early on in the Reformation, Luther is like doubling down on real presence, and the Swiss reformers under Zwingli follow some thinkers who say, well, it's only a symbol. And for Luther, this is just ruled out of court immediately. I mean, just look at the words of the Bible. This is my body. That's all he needs. It just says, this is my body. It can't mean anything else. And so he compares them to Berengarius. And so these debates, it's so interesting over history. Berengarius and his opponents is one debate that gets sort of recast as Catholics versus Protestants at the time of the Reformation. But that can't be quite right, because the Catholic position was the resolution of that original one. But because, as we talked about earlier, the language of substance has shifted, it makes the Catholic position look like it's the physical, carnal kind of understanding. And then at least some Protestants get seen as the opposite of that, although Luther would be on the Catholic side on that one. And then down to this day, we're still rehashing a lot of the same categories without knowing that transubstantiation emerges 750 years ago or whatever it was, precisely to resolve that conflict. And it does a really good job of it. Like, substance actually works as a way of describing something that's really real, that's not physical. But both Catholics and Protestants are often sort of blissfully unaware that that's what happened.
I know that was one thing in your book that I'm so glad I'm reading this, and it's also like almost embarrassed that I did not know so much of it already, because it was like, of course, like when I was reading it, it just resonated with my mind so much, versus like sometimes I feel like I accept things on faith, but I have to work through them, but they don't quite jive. And then I was realizing that I was taking things that it was just like a relief to me to be able to like let me. So very much appreciate it.
God bless you. I mean, really, that's why I wrote it, because if I may, so some people worry that if you write a book like this, you're kind of qualifying the real presence away too much. So what we really need is to like double down, and nuance is the enemy, right? And we just need to like be super clear, and then we'll get more people to believe in real presence. And my experience has been instead that there's a lot of people who are in a position similar to yours, who are like, I want to believe this. I think it's what the church says. I think I'm supposed to believe it. I'm not sure it makes sense. And so I'm in this awkward in-between state. And when I hear what the church actually says, it comes as a relief. And even your own sense of embarrassment. I mean, that was my sense when I said physically, and my professor was like, that might be a heresy, Brett. And I was like, whoa, okay, well, tell me more, So I was a little embarrassed. And then I tried to write the book without telling the story of my own mistake. And the first chapter didn't work. And this is a fun story. So I wrote the chapter and I was a scold. I said, look at these Catholics who misrepresent their teaching and these Protestants who think they're attacking Catholic faith, but they don't even know. And I was this kind of scold. And my prof said, we need a different angle in on this. Like, it's just not the way into your audience's heart and mind, And she died of cancer when I was halfway through the thing. And we had not resolved. She said, go ahead and write chapter 2. We'll revisit chapter 1 once the whole thing is done, and maybe it'll be clearer in hindsight. I wrote chapter 2. She thought it was really good. She never saw chapter 3. On the night she died, I was saying my prayers, and I got to the point in my prayers where I pray for Margaret, who was suffering from cancer. And I realized that I was in a different relationship with Margaret now, because not only would I pray for her, but I would be praying with her. And it didn't take 60 seconds before I realized that the answer to the problem in chapter 1 was, don't scold other people. Tell them about your own mistake and how you came to understand it. And I'm a little suspicious of myself because, you hear something in prayer and you're like, well, maybe I'm just making it up. So I went to my new director and I said, look, this happened in my prayer. Do you think I'm onto something? He said, yeah, that's the answer, So anyways, I had to tell the story in the book of my own error and me coming to my own, me being corrected and coming to a deeper understanding in light of my own mistake. And I hope that gives permission for other people rather than standing back and scolding them and tell them they get it wrong and they should be smarter and better and more faithful and just listen to me, because I'm the expert.
I 100% that did what you intended, because when I was reading it, it was just like, okay, I can latch onto this, his way through it, like I could follow your journey. And so it wasn't so scary because you were like leading it. And it was just like like you said, perfect opening.
Oh,
so thank you.
Well, thank you, Margaret. Margaret O'Gara was my director, and just I couldn't have had a better one. So even after her death,
she got to work right away.
Yeah.
So you kind of mentioned this too, how sometimes people think it's defining the mystery or trying to, explain it away. But to me, it's just like setting those philosophical boundaries and sort of what it's not. And to me, it just feels like it's saying it's a mystery, but like with more steps.
Right. Yeah, no, this is one criticism of transubstantiation, commonly from the East, Eastern Orthodox criticisms of transubstantiation will say, in the West, they over-rationalize everything. This is an over-rationalization of the mystery. But occasionally also Protestants will make this point. C.S. Lewis has a famous line where he says, the Lord said, take and eat, not take and understand. So I think that's in Letters to Malcolm. Anyways, so this is a kind of standard accusation, and it's possible. Catholics can do a presentation of transubstantiation that makes it sound like sort of clandestine mechanics, and that's the wrong approach. But the reason the East doesn't need transubstantiation is because they never had the Eucharistic controversies of the Middle Ages. The church didn't need it for 1,200 years. But once the question was raised, in what way is this real, and how is this a symbol, and how is it not a symbol? Once it gets framed that way, you need to answer it. And appeals to mystery don't cut it when people say, when people put forward those different theories. And so what you need to do is you need to be able to articulate something in a way that shows that it's not nonsense. I think that's a helpful way to think about it. Like, transubstantiation shows, in light of questions about what do we mean by real and is it just a symbol and whatever, that the church's historical faith in Christ's real presence is not nonsensical. And we need philosophy to be able to show that, right? And substance becomes a way of saying, look, you every day, you affirm the presence of things with your mind, even though you only can access their physical attributes through your senses. Like that's a normal human action. And Aristotle had language for this. He called it substance and accidents, but it's actually kind of the language of common sense. If you pay attention to what you're doing when you encounter artifacts in the world, that's what happens. So let's just reflect on that and see if that will get us some categories for thinking about what might be happening at the Eucharist. Now, it's not the same thing as what happens in your day-to-day experience. And as you walk through Thomas, you're going to see he does this compare and contrast. It's like natural change in this way, but it's unlike natural change in this way. It's like creation, in fact, in this way, which is also a mystery and is only explainable by the power of God, but can still be protected with some philosophical language to not be misapprehended, right? It's like it in some ways and not like it in other ways. And he's going to do this sort of careful sifting. But never does he sort of over-rationalize or try to give some sort of like clandestine mechanics. He just wants to say that the church's traditional affirmation that Christ is really present is not incoherent. Because that was part of the Berengarian argument. And by many of Berengarius's heirs, it's like, look, it can't really mean this is my body. It has to mean this symbolizes my body, because just look at it. It still looks like bread. It doesn't look like a piece of flesh. Now, the answer to that isn't to say, and some people tried this, right? Actually, it does look like flesh, but your eyes are preserved from seeing that so that you're not disgusted by taking the Eucharist, right? That was an overreaction in the other way. And transubstantiation was not a reinforcement of that, even though sometimes it's taken that way. It was actually a rejection of that. It was saying, no, that's overkill, you guys. And Thomas is very explicit that there's no deception in the sacrament. So there's none of this idea that that's the reality of it is hidden from us to preserve us from disgust or something. The reality is hidden from us because it's not something you can actually see. It's only something that could ever be present through some other mediating thing. Well, until you have the eye of faith that sees truly in heaven, right? When all mediation is gone. But in this life, it's going to be mediated. So he builds this. I always say he, Thomas, because the classic articulation is in Thomas. But the tradition more generally builds this protection around the mystery by protecting it from incoherence and sort of false claims against it. But it's not meant to explain it completely. In the end, you have to go back to two things. It's really interesting that Protestantism, in its two main branches at the beginning, each pick one. One is the word of Christ, and that's Luther. And the other is the power of the Spirit, and that's Calvin. But for Thomas, it's both. It only ever is explainable in that final sense by appeal to God's power through the Son or the Spirit, right? And both, in fact, like you mentioned, the words of consecration and the epiclesis, which is the Son and the Spirit, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Those, great. I mean, I just love listening to this because there's always something I feel like I've researched it, I read your book, and then I'm still learning, so much there.
It's always good to hear things from more than one, angle. And it's good for me to say it more than once. I learn by trying to articulate it. So
good. Yeah. So something that stood out to me in your book was like the substance is not swapped with a different substance. It's not like somebody was saying in my comments that it's like here's a car and we're going to switch it to a horse and now it's a horse even though it still looks like a car. Like that's not what we're saying. And it's also, I think, isn't it unique? It can uniquely be Christ because Christ is, like you said, somehow else. He's not like or God is not someone else or somewhere else. He's somehow else. And it's a unique, like, way to, it's like distinct to God, that only he could do this.
Right. Yeah. So you can't do alchemy like this, right? You can't say this is a bar of lead, but its substance has been changed into gold by these magic words, and so now I'm going to sell it to you for more money. Like it's not the kind of thing that could ever happen between two creatures that exist on the same plane of existence. And this is very clear as Thomas walks through the different ways you might misunderstand or misinterpret transubstantiation. There were sort of three options in play. One was that the substance of the body of Christ is removed and then replaced by the substance of Christ's body, as if they were kind of on the same level of reality, and then one just swaps in and out for the other. The other one is it's destroyed. So the substance of the bread is destroyed, and then the substance of Christ's body is sort of immediately created in that void, right? And Thomas says neither of those will work. And to go, it maps onto your previous question about mystery. He says both of these are too mechanistic. They imagine like Christ's body zipping around in space, or like it imagines the substance of Christ's body as like one more physical thing that's the same kind of thing as all the other things. And he says, no, what happens is that the existing substance of the bread is precisely what becomes the body of Christ, right? So it's not swapped out and it's not destroyed and replaced, but it itself becomes the new thing. And there's a few ways that I find helpful to think about this. One is like, what is bread actually for? What's the end of bread? Well, the end of bread is to become a body. Like it's food and you eat it and you turn it into your body. Like this is in the natural order of things. Now, transubstantiation is not in the natural order of things, but it doesn't run against the grain, right? It's the eschatological end of bread is to become body, right? And your body, my body, that's a higher order thing than bread that takes into itself something lower and makes it part of ourselves, right? And we sort of transcend it. Like when you eat a sandwich, you're kind of transcending this thing by bringing it into a higher order of reality. Now it becomes living matter, when it was dead before or whatever, inert. And so the movement, the eschatological movement of transubstantiation is that of lifting up the lower into the higher. And so the bread becomes something greater, but it's not unrelated to what bread was always for in the first place. Jesus comes to us as food for a reason. He is supposed to be our sustenance in our life, right? So it's not an arbitrary symbol that just, it's easily portable or some, nonsense like the symbol actually matters, right? And he has this really wild line that you have to reread like 4 or 5 times, where he says the bread becomes Christ's body by having something taken away from it. He says Christ takes away that which was keeping it from being his body. And you're like, well, that's wild, right? Because you couldn't do that with a horse or a car. That you couldn't say, I take away from this horse that which is keeping it from being a car. That it's hard to know what that would even mean. But in this case, Thomas is saying something like Christ is the one through whom God made the universe. He's the foundation of being and of creation. And what distinguishes anything from the one through whom God made the universe is their creaturely independence. And so what is taken away from the bread so that it becomes the body of Christ is its independence. It becomes, in the end of time, we say Christ will be all in all, right? And that's what happens to the bread. It's prefiguring the end of all things to become all in all in Christ. Now, there's an important distinction to make here, which is bread doesn't have a soul. Whereas you and I have a soul. So we're not going to just become Christ in a sense of losing our identity, but we will become Christ. I mean, we will be the body of Christ. We already are in an imperfect way here. We will be perfectly the body of Christ in heaven, but that does not imply the negation of our being the way it does with something like negation of being that's still too strong, because bread's being is not negated, it's elevated, but it does lose its independence in a way that's a little different from how we will, because we will still maintain independence in a certain sense, that we will maintain our identities, right?
Right. I love this aspect of Ratzinger talks about this a lot. The Christian anthropology and the understanding of identity, of personal identity, where your identity is revealed through relationship, through Christ especially, and not apart from it. So it's like, what does it mean to be a man? It doesn't mean to like be strong and tough and like pad your autonomy that you already have. It means to like go fight for your country. It means to go lay down your life. Like to be a man is like to go beyond yourself. And it's in relation to the man, or, you know, to the woman and the child, that man really becomes, what does it mean to be a man?
Right.
To protect. It's, you know, and so there's this element of, this is kind of a tangent, but to go back to that, it's just the way that, like, it's a Trinitarian aspect to this also, where the bread becomes more, it becomes Christ, but it doesn't lose its, and, you know, I don't know if that is making, it's actually revealed.
It's fulfilled rather than destroyed, right?
Right, yeah. Right, exactly.
So there's actually a deep, you're onto something. It's not quite so much of a tangent. I go into this in the book. I mean, it's kind of complex, but theologians say, like, Thomas's understanding of transubstantiation only makes sense if you get his doctrine of creation. And his doctrine of creation insists that the fundamental reality is relationality. Things exist in relation to God, rather than independently subsisting entities being fundamental and then they're brought into relation. The act of creation itself is to be put into relationship with God. And only if you have that sense of creation does what he ends up saying later about this, you know, this odd line about taking away what kept it from being Christ, right? That only makes sense if you understand his doctrine of creation. So I do spend a little time on that in the book, but it applies in a whole range of areas, as you point out. Fatherhood is a relational term. It's not an independently existing thing. It makes sense in relation to motherhood and childhood, or it's not even a thing, you know. And the point is, like, all things are actually relational. And so their independence is a secondary feature rather than a primary feature. And so they can lose their independence in a sense without being destroyed, right? They can lose their independence in a sense that can elevate them, which is how, and Ratzinger actually does. I quoted this article he wrote in like the 60s, which is not a well-known article, but he did the standard like Thomas Luther Calvin thing in his article, and I quoted it so much that we had to pay the the copyright holder because I was over the limit, you know. But it's an excellent article, and in fact, when I first wrote it, it wasn't even available in English. The translator, I got a hold of the translator, and he said, oh, he's the translator who does a lot of Ratzinger stuff for Ignatius Press, and he said, oh yeah, that's a great essay. I'm working on it. I'll send you a draft. So I worked from a draft of his translation because my German was not good enough to really go after it, you know. Even I passed the exams for German, but it's not the same thing. And then by the time the book came out, my book came out, this essay had been published in a collected volume of Ratzinger's works. And so I could go in and use the real official translation. So I had to go, correct a few things that had shifted over that time period.
That's nice. You had access to it, that you could use it while you.
Oh, the day I got that email, I was so stoked because I was like slogging through this German, and I was like, I know this is good, but man, you know.
Well, then it's a kind of a complex issue to do.
Yeah, no, it's not like what I always say this with my kids, like es regnet und der Himmel ist grau, right? Like it's not talking about the weather. You know?
Yeah, exactly. That would be tough. So I was just going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to go a little question now that I didn't have on send you early, but it was about So I love Pope Benedict XVI. He hardly ever mentions Aquinas that I've read, and he hardly ever mentions transubstantiation, but he talks a lot about the Eucharist. And one of the things that I really appreciated that he kind of what we talked about too is that, you know, Christ is the greater power. So the bread becomes part of us in a normal bread. But then when we eat, there's like an inversion where we, by eating the bread or the signs of the bread, become Christ in like one with Christ, where he's actually the one conforming us to his body. It's like a force, he says that like reaches out and grabs you and takes hold of you.
Well, two things. One, Ratzinger's, the line about Christ sort of reversing the process and incorporating us into his body rather than the other way. The origin of that is a dream that Augustine had, where he hears in the dream that I am stronger food than you, and you will eat me, and rather than me becoming you, you will become me. So that's in the tradition. That's an ancient image. But Ratzinger, he doesn't talk about, he writes this article about transubstantiation, which has to mention Aquinas a bit, but he's not an Aquinas scholar.
No. Yeah.
He's more along, like he studied Bonaventure. He's really an Augustinian. But he does use some really striking metaphors from like contemporary physics. So another one that he uses, I think this is in Sacramentum Caritatis, he talks about the catalyst at the beginning of a chain reaction. So he talks about how, like the transformational pattern, like the Eucharist isn't transformed from bread to Christ's body for its own sake, but in order to transform the church, us, into Christ's body, which is not for its own sake either, but to transform the world and all of creation, right? And so he sees the Eucharistic consecration as the beginning of like a chemical chain reaction that leads to the transformation of the whole cosmos, first via the species of bread and wine, then via us, the members of the church, then the church in the world, you know. So he does have these kind of beautiful images.
One of the things too was like Protestants, when you were mentioning Protestants, I feel like they have a really good sense of that spiritual presence of God, like that he always comes to us. He's always, you know, Lutherans, they emphasize the coming to us, that, and we have that with the epiclesis also. I think what's different and distinct about this transubstantiation or sacramental presence of Christ is that it is precisely what we talked about. It's like a Christ who not only comes to us, but conforms us to him. And so I feel like that comes out in so many different ways in Catholic theology of
the way Catholics describe what Christ is doing in the Eucharist is much more situated within the sense of the body historically and transhistorically, like the communion of saints that have gone before us, the church present across the world today, the church present through history. There's a much more, right? Whereas when Protestants talk about Christ coming to us, it often, not always, it often has a kind of individualistic tone. And there's something true about that too, right? Mm-hmm. Like Christ does come for each of us individually. But, you know, so there's something we can learn from each other. And I find like this is not actually a real divide between Catholics. Like usually when the Protestants emphasize this, Catholics are like, yeah, that sounds about right. And when Catholics emphasize the more communal, Protestants don't typically dispute that. But our typical language of it tends to be a little different, have a little different emphases. Although within our traditions, there's different things, you know, different pious practices within Catholicism might emphasize more individual stuff than the communal celebration of the Mass, right? Individual pious practices around the consecrated host, for example. And that can be good, but also you don't want to have it in a way that's isolated from the celebration of the community either, right? You want to keep those things integrated. So
yeah, it's like, well, you need the one-on-one with God in order to actually be reconciled. That's why we do the peace after the Eucharistic, like it flows from the one and then goes to the many. Like
right.
So
you can't skip that.
Right. Yeah, right. So it's not just communal. It's the one-on-one to be brought into, made truly one in the body of Christ with everyone else also. So I really appreciated your treatment of Luther and Calvin. You point out like when you take all of the different philosophical assumptions that they had into account, that they're so much closer than I had thought. And I would say, like, transubstantiation is such a charged term, it seems like sometimes. But would you say that it's just the normative language? Like, it's not the only way of describing this process? Like, it's the only one we have, but it doesn't.
Right. Trent says it's the most apt, aptissime. It's the most apt language we have. I mean, you can't make it a strict requirement because the church didn't have it for 1,100 years. So obviously there have to be adequate ways of describing the Eucharist without it, or you're saying like Augustine, didn't have a legitimate theology of the Eucharist. We recognize the Eucharistic theologies of the East, whether or not they want to incorporate transubstantiation. So you can absolutely talk about the Eucharist and Christ's Eucharistic presence without transubstantiation. The concern for Catholics when we're in dialogue with most Protestants is that when they talk, if they have a doctrine of Eucharistic presence, in the background of that doctrine is usually a formal declaration against transubstantiation, right? And that makes it trickier, right? Because you're saying, okay, so you're talking about it this way, and that sounds like it might be okay. But you also include in your tradition this like outright rejection of transubstantiation. So it's hard for us to know that what you're affirming here is really the faith of the church if this rejection is still on the books. And so in ecumenical dialogue, then you have to say, okay, so what did you mean to reject when you rejected that? Because if what you meant to reject was a misunderstanding, which was common enough, historically, that's easy to demonstrate. If you were rejecting a misunderstanding and what you reject is also something we would reject, and this can be demonstrated quite easily in like the annihilation thing that we said. Thomas does not go in for the annihilation version. Well, there are examples in Protestantism that are rejections of transubstantiation that are explicitly and clearly rejections of the annihilation version of transubstantiation. Well, they're rejecting something that Thomas himself rejects. But the point is, you have to do the careful historical sifting when you have a rejection of transubstantiation on the books in your tradition. Then if the Catholic Church is going to acknowledge your Eucharistic theology, we need to clear up just what is intended here and what isn't. So it gets tricky. But what you say is exactly right. It can't be the only way of talking about it, or we'd have to say St. Paul, St. Augustine, St. Ambrose, St. John Chrysostom, the whole Christian East, the Maronites, like a lot of Christians never had a legitimate doctrine of the Eucharist. And clearly that's not what we think.
Right. Thank you for explaining. So one final thing, and then I'll let you go because this is going longer than I intended, but don't want to take your time.
No worries.
For the Eucharistic miracles, I think that's one of the common things that people love to talk about, the Eucharistic miracles, where the host appears to turn into real blood or real flesh. And to me, that that seems like obviously very different than what we just talked about. So how did Aquinas understand Eucharistic miracles?
Right. So Aquinas thinks he seems to think that they're possible, that they might happen sometimes. He's quite circumspect about affirming, he doesn't want to put his eggs in that basket as proof for real presence. This is right. So it's something that God may do in a given time and place to increase faith. But it should not be mistaken for like the real thing. Like the real miracle of the Eucharist is the one that happens like every day. And in 99.99999% of the time, there's no change to the accidents at all, right? And that's the normal Eucharistic miracle, which is Christ becomes present to us at the words of consecration. If something were to happen where the physical reality of the host were to change, that's not transubstantiation. That's by definition, that's the opposite. That's transaccidentiation. Now, the church has affirmed these they have happened in the life of the church. So I have no interest in denying them. But I don't want to put so much weight on them. Christians have believed in, long before they were known commonly in the church, people believed in real presence. And we don't want to give the impression that what happens at the average Sunday is somehow less than those. In a certain sense, it's more, or it's at least equal. Thomas also has this interesting line where he says sometimes these miracles happen in the species themselves, and sometimes they happen in the eyes, which it's very hard for me to tell if he's being cheeky. I don't know if Thomas is saying like sometimes people see things that aren't there, or if he's being straightforward and earnest and saying like sometimes God gives people a vision of what's really going on that helps their faith, right? And maybe those two things aren't even exclusive. Like maybe he means both. I don't know. But he does have this interesting line that sometimes it happens in the species and sometimes it happens in the eyes. And I mean, when the church thinks about miracles, like visions are a kind of miracle that don't necessarily imply some change in the physical universe, right? So that's possible. That could be the work of God too. It could also, not every miracle claim is legit, and the church is very cautious about miracle claims. So it doesn't rush to affirm all of them. I recently was reading about a Catholic scientist who took some unconsecrated hosts and exposed them to certain conditions. And one thing that happened was like a certain red fungus kind of started growing around the edges in some percentage of the cases. Well, the conditions he chose were the same conditions that are prescribed by the church. Let's say you receive the Eucharist and you're sick and you choke and you can't swallow. Now, what are you supposed to do with that host? Well, you're supposed to dissolve it in water, right? Because no one else it's not fit for human consumption anymore. So you're supposed to so he subjected it to these kind of conditions. And sometimes certain kinds of things that are claimed to happen in some Eucharistic miracles happened to unconsecrated hosts. Well, so maybe some of these Eucharistic miracles had natural explanations. And maybe some others didn't. A Catholic shouldn't panic. And this is, this scientist was trying to be, and he was being very faithful. He's following what St. Paul said, test everything, hold to what is good. Mm-hmm. You're not an unfaithful Catholic. Much better that a faithful Catholic does this than that an atheist does this and uses it to mock us. So this guy, I think, was doing us all a service by being honest here. And we don't need to panic if not every claim of a Eucharistic miracle is necessarily legitimized. Like that's we don't believe in transubstantiation because there's at least one legitimate Eucharistic miracle. If there was never a Eucharistic miracle, we would still believe in transubstantiation. Now, I'm like Thomas Aquinas. I'm happy to grant that they probably happen some of the time, but I don't want to put all my eggs in that basket, and I don't want to get confused by describing transaccidentiation as if it's proof of transubstantiation, when in a certain way it's the opposite, right?
Right. Yeah, thank you. I fall also into that camp.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm kind of the essentialist. So.
Right. Yeah. They might be fine, but without them, the faith is untouched. Like it's the faith does not depend on this at all. Right. We need the resurrection. If we don't have that miracle, we're in trouble, but we don't need the other ones.
That's the major. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So as we wrap up, is there anything that you would encourage Catholics to do as they explain the real presence, how to lean into the sacramental presence while also avoiding the too cannibalistic?
Yeah, I mean, well, one thing we talked about earlier is just care with our language. So my recommendation is always use the language of the church. There's a temptation to find the most graphic language you can and double down on it. And that's more likely, in my experience, to lead to confusion and misapprehension and unnecessary division. So use the language of the church, really, truly, substantially, sacramentally, and then use it the way the church uses it, and invite your interlocutor to look at the history of those terms and what they mean and what they don't mean. And then you've got some common ground. That's one thing I would say. Another thing I would say is, and this goes back to, we talked a little bit about my treatment of Luther and Calvin. recognize the intention of the Protestant you're talking to. Many Protestants intend, and Luther and Calvin both intended, a doctrine of real presence. Now, a Catholic looking at it, and I did a deep dive. I mean, they're 80 pages each, my chapters on each of those guys. I end up saying, like, on a couple of points, there was a bit of a swing and a miss. They in their attempt to hold together the real and the sacramental, sometimes there was a little slippage. And for Luther, it's in the direction of the real, and in Calvin, it's in the direction of the sacramental at the expense of the other. But it's clear as day when you read them that they intend the traditional faith of the church. They do not intend to reject the traditional faith of the church. They think that transubstantiation has overshot or misapprehended something in the traditional faith of the church. But they do not want to overthrow the church's faith. Aquinas, Luther, and Calvin all rely on Augustine, all of them. They all think Augustine is their highest authority on this question. So when you start digging, you're going to find similarities. And the differences, you can account for them for different reasons of personality, historical circumstances, philosophical context, and I do all that work in the book. But the point is, their intention is clear, even if as a Catholic you can say they didn't execute perfectly. And I would recommend that to Catholics in dialogue with Protestants. If your Protestant interlocutor wants to articulate real presence, take him or her at their word, and invite them into a dialogue with the tradition that doesn't caricature transubstantiation. And I've been really blessed by Protestants who've read my book, who have really appreciated it, because they think I took Luther and Calvin seriously, I treated them fairly, and then transubstantiation isn't the bogeyman that they were told that it was. And they can, if it doesn't become their favorite articulation, it becomes at least an acceptable articulation, even though their tradition had rejected it in the past. And so I think you can invite Protestants into that conversation, and very often they're going to get at least that far with you. Now, you're going to have other Protestants who will be sort of mere symbolists, right? And think, well, it can't mean this is my body because, like, it's just obvious, just look at it, but it's interesting that position is less common in Protestantism today than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. More and more Protestants are reading the Church Fathers. They're even more are reading Aquinas. And not only, they're reading Luther and Calvin, actually. I've talked to a fellow named Gavin Ortland, who's a Baptist pastor, he's got a big YouTube following, and he's got a video about a Baptist theology of real presence. And he's like, look, Baptists, if you read your own Baptist tradition, you'll find articulations that are much more robust than a merely symbolic version of the Eucharist. So as Protestants get more interested in the historical faith of the church, they're finding, both in our common tradition before the Reformation and even in their own tradition since the Reformation, something that is usually more rich than a merely symbolic thing. So we shouldn't caricature them. Sometimes inviting them into their own tradition and seeing what it says, and then putting that in dialogue with our tradition, you'll get a lot further than you think. And I think that's one of the lessons of my book. When people read it, they're like, I just had no idea that it was that close. And I don't want to paper over differences. Like, in the end, I say there are real differences. But here's what I think they mean, and here's what I think they don't mean. And but even like Catholic and Protestant, like, scholars who've been studying this stuff for years, who've been on international dialogues, all this kind of stuff, are like, wow, this is even closer than I thought. And they find it compelling.
Yeah, absolutely. That was like my takeaway, like, very much. And I grew up Anabaptist, so we have a very ambiguous doctrine. When I was Mennonite, had a very, not very well fleshed out, but there's some, the older, that they, like my grandfather's writings, he was a very Mennonite man. He points to John 6 all the time. It's like, even in that tradition, it seems like there's a closer to the real presence than I would have thought.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, it happens.
Yeah.
It happens over and over in church history.
Yeah.
That because people read the Bible and they read the fathers, and
Yeah.
and it's there. Yeah.
So where can they buy your book? Where's the best place to buy it?
My recommendation is always, if you can, order from your local bookstore, your Catholic or Christian bookstore. Support local bookstores, or if you want to order it online, go to bakerbookhouse.com. Baker is the publisher, and I always recommend buying from publishers, Christian bookstores, if you can do it. Of course, it's available where people buy all their books. If you want to support that, or if you can't get it any other way, I won't judge you. But my recommendation is always to support Catholic or Christian publishers, Catholic and Christian bookstores.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much for being on.
It was lovely to be with you. Nice to meet you, Amy.
Yes, you too.